what do you do if you walk in to a classroom and you're a teacher, and it's an all-girls private school, right? We're just painting the picture here. And you come in and you're the teacher, also a woman, and you come in with your notes and their homework's marked and whatever, and you go, "Afternoon, girls." And you're basically, I mean, I don't know, they sort of metaphorically throw eggs at you, basically, and they are really annoyed, these girls, at being called girls.
Yes, the teacher actually refused to call a child them. She then faced student playground protests, and she claimed she was managed out of her job.
Again, I smile at this because I think of, if I was 11 at school and saying, I'm going to sit down in the playground, or we're going to do, you just would have been expelled. That would have been it. Just shut up and get on with it. Former teacher Leslie Hardesty says you shouldn't be using gender-neutral pronouns. In other words, you shouldn't come in and say, "Hi, guys," or "Hi, class," or something like that.
Couldn't say guys.
You can't say guys.
No.
Right, I don't know. I'd be used to
Whereas Baz Ramia, who's head of policy at the Centre for Education and Youth, says we actually need to support trans kids with inclusive language. So let's open up the debate.
Yes, Baz, so if you walked into that classroom of that afternoon and you were faced with all these little 11-year-olds in pigtails, what would you have said?
Well, I think we can all agree that all of our children deserve to go to a school where they feel safe, welcome and cared for. And when this teacher deliberately decided to not use inclusive language when she found out that there was a gender non-conforming child in her class, she made that child feel unsafe, unwelcome and uncared for.
So we know for a fact there was some child there who felt worried by this use, or were they just all making a general point?
No, that's what I understand of the story, Eamon, is that a child did identify themselves as being gender non-conforming. The teacher refused to use their preferred term of reference. The following morning, she returned to the classroom to find that class had actually, quite conscientiously and mindfully, written their names on the whiteboard and said what their preferred pronouns were, their preferred terms of reference. At that point, she continued to refuse. At that point, this teacher is deliberately choosing to make this child feel unsafe.
You would have come in and said, "Afternoon class."
I think there's various terms that can be used, and I think afternoon class is a good one, afternoon children, afternoon young people. There's lots of guidance out there from organisations that have a lot of expertise in this area. I think this is a really important issue because we know that gender non-conforming young people are a very vulnerable group of young people. 65% of them experience bullying, and a lot of that bullying can end in tragedy, as we saw in the case of the tragic murder of Brianna Gay recently. So it's absolutely vital that teachers who take their protective duty seriously make these vulnerable young people feel safe.
So let's see what Leslie thinks about this. Do teachers have a duty of care then to take into consideration those vulnerable pupils, or do you see it as acquiescing to the demands of precocious 11-year-old girls?
Well, I had an autistic child who at 11 wanted to be a boy because boys got more treats and more food. And she actually ended up in care because she became so absolutely past herself in knowing what was the future for her. And I think you've got to be very careful at 11 that they're very impressionable, going to go through puberty, aren't really aware of what's around them, seeing too much on the internet and being influenced by other people. And I think if a parent chooses to send a child to an all-girls school, then they have identified their child as a girl.
Right, OK. So you would say, actually, you're not doing that kid any favours by what you would see as sort of pandering to what are impressionable views at the moment, and actually you're doing that child a favour by honouring the parents' wishes and referring to them in their biological sex?
Yes, until they're old enough to make that decision. And we've seen recently with the Tavistock clinic that, children have wished that as they got older that they hadn't transitioned.
So what would you have said that afternoon? How would you have addressed the class?
Well, I might have said girls because they were girls. And I think you've got to be very careful as well with this choice of they and them, because they and them is plural. It's not singular, and it's very confusing if you're using the wrong pronoun in a singular fashion. So I think we also have to respect the traditional English language and continue to use the correct pronouns in the correct way. And if you want to use a gender-neutral pronoun, it's it, and we refer to animals as it.
Well, not even all animals. People sometimes refer to animals in much more affectionate terms than that. Baz, what do you make of all of that? I mean, there is an argument. We hear of these high-profile people, say Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who says, gosh, if I had been growing up in today's society, I'd have been all over the place, incredibly confused and wanted to identify as a boy. She was a tomboy. She loved boys' things. She loved her hair short, and then she grew out of it. And there has to be a legitimate concern, as Leslie says, about trying to help people grow up before they make
But
these
she wasn't a boy.
decisions.
She wasn't a boy. Why would you have called her a boy?
I'm just saying she's grateful she wasn't in that situation, or she'd have ended up perhaps going down that road, but actually she grew out of it, which was, as Leslie was saying. I'm just saying, Baz, is there not a danger?
I think the issue here fundamentally is that schools are not sealed off from the world. Schools are part of the world. And the fact is that the world is changing. People's attitudes in the world towards gender are changing. People's experience of gender is changing. According to the most recent census, 250,000 people in the UK identify as being transgender in some form or another. 90% of secondary school teachers have at least one pupil who identifies as being transgender. So the world is changing, and that's not something schools can stop. But what schools can do is they can choose how they respond to it. And if we want schools to be places that are caring, compassionate and safe for vulnerable young people, then they can change by changing their language to be inclusive.
By highlighting that someone wants to be referred to as different. And we all know that bullying thrives on differences as well. That by saying, I am different, call me they or them or whatever, that sets them out.
I don't think that's the case. I think when teachers deliberately and knowingly in front of a class refuse to acknowledge a transgender or non-conforming child's identity, they send a signal to the children in that class that it is OK to disrespect that child. It is OK to treat them as if a big part of their identity does not matter. And we know that the consequence of that is, as I was saying, 65% of transgender young people experience bullying. They also experience mental health issues, suicide and alienation from family at much higher rates. So we're talking about a group of young people who are already very vulnerable, and it is an absolute duty of care for all teachers to make those young people feel safe. And that's the kind of schools we want in our country.
I had a child that did transition, and as a special needs teacher, I was very sensitive to children's needs. But I had a little girl who also thought she should be a boy because she liked cricket and football. I've had a niece whose daughter's tried to commit suicide because of the internet rubbish that she was reading and got completely confused by her gender. And now at 18, she's sorted and settled and realises that she is a girl. So you can push the transgender issue far too young, and then make that complication too great. And by singling them out, actually, and by not referring to girls as girls, you draw attention to them, and that can actually cause more bullying.
OK. Guys, you both stated your case very well. Which one has got the right answer to all of this, Baz or Leslie? Thank you both very, very much indeed.